All. This is Dr. Mobeen Sayed from drbeen.com. Welcome to one more show. Today we're going to talk about the irregular periods after vaccination. So there have been many reports about this, and I think one event where one female doctor, I believe, tweeted that, hey, my periods have become irregular after the vaccination, and that kind of started other people to respond to her and say that, hey, this is happening to us as well. And from there, the momentum started, and now there are surveys going on. I think there are some studies that are happening as well. There are some studies that are already done, but these are too small to be able to consider them significant, but there are more studies that have started. So with this, what I wanted to do was, I wanted to go over the possibility, the mechanisms that can be involved in the process of irregular periods due to vaccinations. So let's start our discussion. So the links here. So this is drbeen.com. Here is an article, not a study, an article, long COVID and periods, then premenstrual syndromes, and we're going to talk about that a tiny bit here. The COVID-19 vaccine, irregular periods, and spike protein shedding. Then some people reporting abnormal periods after receiving COVID-19 vaccines. Then these are a couple of important medical concepts that we would look at. Number one, estrogen receptors in immunity and autoimmunity. And number two, endometrium, and here progesterone receptors as well. With that, we'll also talk about the influence of progesterone, which is also one more hormone for menstrual cycles. Progesterone influences vitamin D. So these are the important ones. And finally, why is there menstrual period pain? So we'll touch upon all of those. Let's start our discussion. So here is a summary. If you just wanted to know what is going on, here is a summary. There are reports of irregular periods, and in that, there are reports of heavy periods with clotting and even premenstrual syndrome as well, where there is a possibility of depression, bloating, pain, back pain, abdominal pain, lower abdominal pain, and so on. Now, there was a survey done for the irregular period, and the survey's result actually came back with people saying, hey, after the vaccine, we had light period instead of heavy. So I think that both of these are possible, and we'll look at the mechanism for how they both are possible. So that is one. These are the observations. There is no study yet. That means when people say there is no data yet, so don't be offended. Let's say if you have a vaccine and your periods are irregular, do not be offended that they are saying there is no data and say, hey, here I am. They are saying that we do not have data collected and presented in the form of a study yet. But we are seeing this in the society. We are observing this. So they're not denying that this is happening. They're simply saying we are collecting data. Now, is it possible? Yes. And I would discuss the mechanism after this summary. Is it temporary? Yes. It is not something that would be long-term. So the way to look at this is that just like after the vaccine, there is fever, or maybe there is headache, which would not last forever. Similarly, this is one more symptom of the inflammation that occurs after the vaccine, and this would also be temporary. So with this is the basic discussion. I'm going to now enter the mechanisms of how this can happen. So let's start with uterus. So here we have uterus. This area is vagina. This is fallopian tube. Here is an ovary. And we know that what happens is that every month in the ovary, so and I'm going to look at that a little bit more in detail later on, but just generally in the ovaries, there are a number of ova that start becoming mature, that start become ready to be fertilized. So when they start becoming ready, they all have various sizes. At the end, whichever has the largest size, that ova that would pop, and the ova would start traveling in the fallopian tube. There are fimbria at the end of the fallopian tube. They are like little fingers. So imagine if my hand here, my hand is the ovary, and on the hand this is the fallopian tube, and the fallopian tube has um, the fimbria at the end. So they are continuously kind of sucking. And so when the ova is released, it is moved into the fallopian tube and not lost in the abdominal cavity. So once the ova goes in the fallopian tube, ideally a sperm may be there as well. That is what the body is thinking. And then the fertilization would occur. That fertilized sperm and ova, that fertilized cells would finally end up in the uterus. Now, the uterus itself, if you see here, this red layer, let me make my cursor green. So this is the muscle of the uterus. So this is the muscle, this is the muscle. So uterus itself is a muscular organ inside the muscle. So if we traverse from vagina, so from the vagina, that is, vagina opens to the exterior of the body. So that means that the surfaces of the vagina, or all those surfaces that open to the exterior, are called epithelium. Their cells are called epithelium. So these surfaces of the vagina would then continue on through the cervix into the uterus. So this is the uterine surfaces. These are all epithelial cells. However, they are called endometrium. The muscle itself here is called myometrium. Myo stands for the muscle. And then the inner surfaces are endometrium. These surfaces are the ones that every month they would proliferate, they would grow in size, they would increase in number, the cells, they will become spongy, they would become ready to receive a fertilized egg, and then embed that in here and then help that egg, fertilized egg, become a baby. So if that does not happen, if the fertilization does not happen, then all of that preparation to receive a fertilized egg and then to make a baby here, all that preparation is removed, and that is when the periods occur. This is the general structure of this. Now, what happens in a cycle is the following. So let's start from day one after menstruation. So let's say there is a woman who menstruated, and this is the end of the menstruation, or day one of the menstruation. In here, if you see this red part here, whatever is the spongy surfaces that were formed inside the uterus, these are all shed off. So please keep this in mind, they are removed. Removal of a surface, imagine if somebody, and this is an extreme example, but please go with me. Imagine if somebody peels the skin off. This is not an easy thing. This is not a simple process. So when the internal surfaces of the uterus are peeled off and sloughed off, and then they're shed, of course, there is a lot of inflammation going on there. This is the key thing to remember for today, that when the uterine walls, not walls, the endometrium is sloughing off, there is a lot of inflammation going on. So what happens is, during the cycle, once the menstruation occurs, the endometrium has shed, and very thin wall of the endometrium is left. Of course, please remember that the whole epithelium is not removed. The basal layer, so imagine, I'm going to give a weird example. Let's say the mucous membrane of the mouth is that basal layer. So that basal layer is left. It is not removed. If it is removed, then the uterus will not be able to function anymore. And that is what happens, for example, sometimes when dilatation and curettation is done, DNC is done during abortions, then it is possible multiple abortions can cause damage to the endometrium, and women would find it difficult to conceive if that layer inside has become damaged. So a tiny surface is left. After that, what happens is the body, the uterus, starts preparing for the next possibility of fertilization. That is the next cycle now. So again, that would be a proliferative phase. Proliferative phase, we have done this discussion many times before. Proliferation means in our body, in terms of our cells, that means increasing the number of cells. So what would happen is in the proliferation, the number of cells would start increasing. So if you see this diagram here, that endometrium is now becoming spongy again. It is slowly growing again. Now to grow the endometrium, we have to grow blood vessels in it. As imagine if you're stacking bricks on one on each other, and all of those bricks, the cells, they want nutrition as well. We have to provide them nutrition. So to provide them nutrition, blood vessel also develops. So the whole system of an extra tissue that is developing with its own blood supply is happening right now. This is why it is called proliferation. This phase is under the control of estrogen. There are other hormones as well. For example, follicle stimulating hormone that is working on the ovary to say, hey, follicles, hey, ova, get up, and we need one of you to start becoming mature. Similarly, there is a luteinizing hormone that would occur near the ovulation, which would help pop the ova. We're not talking about that. Two main hormones here, estrogen and progesterone. So in the initial part of the cycle, let's say in the early half of the month, estrogen is the predominant hormone. That hormone is preparing to potentially receive a fertilized egg. Then near the middle of the month, for example, and every woman has a different time frame for this. So I'm just starting from the day one of the menstruation as being the start of the calendar. Then near the 14th day, ovulation occurs. And at the time of ovulation, the temperature goes up a little bit. And hopefully now the body is getting ready to receive a sperm and have the fertilization. At this time, estrogen actually drops down. And that is what we'll talk about today, that why will estrogen drop down? Now, what is the relationship of that with vaccine as well? Okay, and progesterone would start increasing. So the owner of the first part of the cycle is estrogen. The owner of the second part of the cycle and then continuing into the pregnancy is progesterone. So we'll see what are they doing. So now the progesterone has increased, and then the secretory phase appears. What happens is that the spongy uterus would start making mucus, and it would start making a very soft cushion for the fertilized egg to come and embed there, and then for the baby to start developing there. And again, the cycle would repeat. If there is no fertilization, then the menstruation would occur, and then the whole cycle would repeat. Now, where is the inflammation in this? So if we zoom in to the uterus, so let's say this is the uterus, and here is the myometrium, or the muscle of the uterus. So if I make my hand over here into the form of a cup, imagine that the hand itself is the muscle, that is a myometrium, and the inner layer is the endometrium, which becomes all proliferated and then sheds off, and proliferated and then sheds off. That's what happens. So here, if you see, the blue layer is the endometrium. This is the internal surface of the uterus. And this is supported as it grows and becomes spongy and becomes bigger and thick. It is supported by lots of blood vessels. Now, if the fertilization does not occur, then the estrogen would go down and progesterone would come up. And what would happen is that these cells of endometrium will start breaking down. And it is such a fascinating mechanism that how this happens. I still remember we had this question, menstrual cycle, in our first professional. And I had just studied it in so much detail that half of the total paper's time I wrote about the menstrual cycle. And then when I looked at my watch and I was halfway and I had only done one question out of 5, I was then rushing through the rest. So what happens here is that when these cells start breaking down, they would release lots of progesterones or prostaglandins, not progesterone, prostaglandins. Any cell in our body, when it breaks down, it releases prostaglandins. These are inflammatory cytokines. Those prostaglandins in the uterus, once they are released, they would do two things. Number one, they act on the blood vessels, these blood vessels, and they start constricting them. So it is kind of such a painful process that the endometrial layer, the tissue, is actually killed by removing the blood supply to it. So we remove the blood supply, that tissue does not have blood anymore, it becomes ischemic, and that is how it becomes necrosed and sloughs off and then is shed out. So it is not an easy thing, it's a complex process. So here the blood vessels are constricted. When they're constricted, more cells would start dying because they don't get the blood. The second benefit of constriction of the blood vessel is that the bleeding will not occur. But it is just not that simple. What happens is blood vessels would constrict, then they would relax. Then they would constrict, they would relax. And what happens is when they constrict, the tissue in front of them would die. So let's say this tissue would die. And then when these blood vessels would relax, they would bring in a flow of blood that would now kick that dead tissue away from that surface and kind of help it be sloughed off. So there is a pulsation that is going on, and that also causes cramps and pain as well. So vasoconstriction occurs. The second thing which these prostaglandins do is that they work on the muscle of the uterus and they make that cramp as well, or they make that constrict as well. So the whole thing just starts acting like a pump and tries to get that endometrial layer that it is killing removed from the body. So of course, this is a very inflammation-rich environment, and there are lots of inflammatory cytokines. So I'm going to leave a seed here in your mind. Imagine if during this process, we add more inflammatory cytokines. Imagine if we add more inflammatory products here, then the same mechanism will be amplified. And that is exactly what happens during the irregular periods. The good news is that the vaccine does not cause the inflammatory cytokines forever. So this would probably happen 1 or 2 cycles, and then this would not happen anymore. Okay, let's continue. Now, what is the relationship of the immune system in it? How does a vaccine come into the play? So look, our body is amazing, and not our body, women's body in terms of preparation for a child and bearing a child. Their body, what happens is that in the first half of menstrual cycle, it is amazing. In the first half of the menstrual cycle, their body is getting ready to ovulate, correct? They are going to shed an ova that would meet a sperm, and there may be fertilization. So body is very, very protective at that time. Body does not want any infection during this time. No virus, no bacteria, no fungus, nothing. We do not want anything to come near us because the body is getting ready to make a baby. So the estrogen phase is dominated by immune system more active than normal. This is the reason, and I'll explain a little later that how does this happen? What does estrogen do to the immune system? But the first thing is that the immune system is extra active. This extra activity also causes women to have more autoimmune diseases. This also causes them to respond more with allergic type reactions, because every month for half of the time, their body is under the influence of estrogen, and estrogen is kicking up the immune system and say, be very, very ready, be very, very protective. I want every single cell to be on guard and be very, very active. So if someone can claim that every fiber of their being is going in love of something, that would be a mother making a baby. Every cell, every chemical is working to help her. So the second part, where the fertilization has occurred, imagine the body thinks that, all right, the ova is here, there would be a sperm as well, and there is a fertilization. Now, the body does not want immune system to interfere anymore. Why? Because sperm is a foreign cell that is in. Then the embryo that would start forming, the fertilized egg that would start forming, and the baby that would start forming is a foreign substance as well. Should call it substance, is a foreign entity as well. Now immune system has to learn how to love this extra tissue, how to love this foreign material with every single cell. So now the immune system has to go down. So every month, a woman's after menstruation, if that is started as a calendar, first half their immune system is overactive. Second half, their immune system is underactive. First half, they're protecting the body. Second half, they're protecting the baby. That is how the cycle is going on. Now the question is, how does immune system do this under the influence of these hormones? And this would then tie back to vaccine, that when vaccine comes into the play and this is happening, and now you put some inflammatory cytokines, this whole thing gets disrupted. So let's see what happens. This is the estrogen, so the first half of from the day one of the menstruation. What happens is estrogen, so here is estrogen. Estrogen is a steroid hormone. It has receptors inside the cell and inside the DNA, inside the nucleus. When estrogen is brought in, look at this. This is the nuclear factor kappa B. We have been talking about this with ivermectin as well. Estrogen can actually bind to nuclear factor kappa B and then work with the inflammatory cytokines to enhance the immune system. That is one possibility. Other possibility, estrogen receptors, which are called alpha and beta receptors, they are present inside the nucleus on the DNA as well. So estrogen can go directly to them and stimulate them, and in result produce inflammatory cytokines that would then cause the immune system to be kicked up. An immune system would be hyperactive and protective. That is the function of estrogen. So what is the function of estrogen? It would help in the first part of the menstrual cycle, first half of the menstrual cycle, to keep the immune system kicked up. Now imagine during this time, a vaccine is taken. And the vaccine produces antibodies. These help produce the inflammatory cytokines. Those cytokines are now also present. So the estrogen is already kicking up the inflammatory system. And now vaccine comes in and also kicks up the inflammatory system. That would cause, number one, a slight more tilt towards the extra immune responses, including the extra immune response inside the uterus, causing extra bleeding or bleeding irregularities. So that is estrogen. Now let's look at how progesterone works. Remember progesterone's function. It is the second half of the menstrual cycle. In this time, progesterone is the governor, that is the owner. And progesterone's function is to reduce and suppress the immune system so that if a baby is going to be formed, we can have immune tolerance to it. We can tolerate that tissue. So here is progesterone. And I'm sorry, I keep saying we, it is a woman. I think men cannot even fathom how to participate in this process other than just once. So progesterone, so when the progesterone, again, steroid hormone, so it comes in and attaches to the progesterone receptors. They are also present in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. Progesterone in turn, check this out, it does this function on T regulatory cells. And just to give us an idea of T regulatory cells, remember that we have been making this diagram a lot. Innate arm, let's say dendritic cell or the macrophages. Then we have the naive T cell. From there, we can go T helper 2 pathway or T helper 1 pathway. And then that goes B cell or that goes cytotoxic T cell. And sometimes I draw this as well, that this could go T helper 17 cell as well, which is the T regulatory cells whose job is to calm down the immune system. Correct? This cell is the main target of progesterone. So what happens is when progesterone appears in our body, in a woman's body, it acts on the T regulatory cell. And for anyone who is going to say, what is Mubin talking about? Here is the study. Progesterone influences vitamin D and the immune responses. This is a 2015 study published in Journal of Immunology. So the link is present in the description as well. So now I'm going to go back here. So when progesterone appears here, other than its other functions that it does, it creates more vitamin D receptors in the cell. More vitamin D receptors mean more or an optimized function of the vitamin D, which in a T regulatory cell is to tell the cell to tell other cells to calm down. This is why we never say that vitamin D causes excessive immune system or reduced immune system. Vitamin D can actually help modulate the immune system. Depends upon what cell is responding. If it is a T regulatory cell, then it is going to bring the immune system downwards. If it is a cytotoxic T cell or T helper cell, it is going to bring the immune system upwards, T helper 1 or 2. So this is the function of the progesterone. What does that do? When progesterone is active, that's the second half of the menstruation, T regulatory cells become more active than the rest of the immune system cell. And these cells tell the rest of the immune system cells to calm down, develop tolerance. And they start saying, I love everything around me. This is the loving that possibly the child with every single cell of the mother, that every cell is now taking part. Okay, continuing. Now, what happens with the vaccine? Very simple process. Here comes the vaccine. Vaccine we know causes, it's picked up by, let's say, innate arm. Innate arm would now start amplifying the acquired arm. Over there, we may go T helper 1 or dominantly one side and recessively the other, whichever way that works. We've done this discussion. The end result is cytokines increase. Cytokines increase. Inflammation increase. Why is my jaw still not fully recovered? I already had jaw pain because of maybe something was going on here, some mild infection. Then the vaccine came in and vaccine has kicked up my immune system. So wherever other spots of inflammation was going on, they are now living longer. It is much better now. I can open my mouth. Similarly, when the inflammation and inflammatory system and cytokines are present, that activity on the uterus of these cytokines will cause irregularity in the period. Now, can this be forever? No. Why can it not be forever? Because this action of the vaccine is temporary. How temporary? Let's look at it. On day 1, we got the vaccine. About 5th day, the vaccine, about 5th day, the antibodies would start becoming formed, right? So that is this side. And those antibodies will now start increasing, and they would continue to increase maybe for a couple of weeks. Then we may need a booster, and then let's say a month later we get the booster, and then even more cells proliferate and antibodies increase even more. And then all during this time, periods are going to be irregular or can be irregular. And then eventually, within a month or so, 2 months, the antibodies are going to start declining. That means the inflammatory state is going to start declining. That means the periods would start becoming regular again. So those folks who are developing this, they would get out of this irregularity within 2-3 months. So that is the discussion for today. Thank you very much for your time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hang up and then come back for the chit chat. Please do me a favor. If you like this work, there are 3 links in the description to support us. One is that if you would like to buy me a coffee. Another one is if you would like to become a patron for this kind of educational material, or if you would just like to support, there is a PayPal link as well. So thank you very much. And the least you can do is to like this video. That would also help. Thank you very much, and I would see you soon.